to you for more after that meeting. And Dr. Andreas Krieg, an assistant professor at King's College in London, joins me now in the studio. Thank you very much for coming in. So what are you expecting out of this meeting?
Not very much, unfortunately. I mean, what we've seen already during Ayunga is always somewhat a circus where you have two sides clashing here this time. And Iran and the United States today are very ideological in how they approach this. Both sides have somewhat, advanced certain narratives that might not be really based on facts. And then that's the problem, because both sides really speak into completely different directions. United States under Trump is very much on unilateralism, isolation, hawkishness, not engagement, but coercion. The Iranians are more up for engagement. They want an open-minded approach. They're trying to engage the Western world. They also have tried to engage the United States under Obama, but have a completely different ideological approach to how international relations are supposed to operate. And I think that's the grand problem here, is that Trump is trying to rally people around against Iran, but at the same time he's trying to undermine multilateralism by saying, we want to do everything ourselves, but actually now he needs the allies to push to kind of come together against Iran if that's what he wants to achieve. But the opposite is actually happening. US allies are actually operating against Donald Trump and seem to engage with Iran, as thereby undermining the strategy.
What he said yesterday in his speech, rejecting the idea of globalism.
Yes, exactly. I mean, he's an anti-globalist, and anti-globalization. China isn't, Iran isn't, the Europeans aren't. All of them believe in multilateralism, and I think that's why their camp is probably a stronger one. And Trump seems to be somewhat isolated in his push, in his hawkish push to isolate Iran.
Well, last year it was North Korea. He called him a rocket
Yes.
man, and yesterday he thanked the chairman Kim, and this time round it's Iran. Why now?
Well, the whole North Korea thing seems to have provided him with the confidence that his push to get deals is actually successful. As a businessman, Donald Trump was always someone who used coercion, putting pressure on people, and then basically first coercion and then engagement, and then getting the kind of concessions that he wanted. Now, it seemed to have worked with North Korea, although we have to make sure here that to say that Donald Trump hasn't achieved anything with North Korea yet. Everything is preliminary. Nothing has really substantially been achieved. But that's for him is a deal. He wants to do the same thing with Iran. So he's trying to carve out one enemy at the time. This time it's Iran. It's been demonized. Iran has been demonized for a long time in this current administration. The neoconservative narrative of the evil empire that seems to undermine the security and stability of the entire Middle East is something that he's been pushed for a long time. But the problem with Iran is by pushing against Iran, isolating Iran, attacking Iran, and calling for regime change. The regime in Iran is obviously not going to engage in any talks, particularly when it doesn't have to. And I think that's a very important point to make here. The United States today are no longer in that kind of position that they might have been 20 years ago. They are no longer the only superpower in the world. There are other alternatives, and the Iranians know also when it comes to trade. There are deals with Russia, deals with Iran, deals with China, deals with the European Union now, because the European Union have now tried to build up a new mechanism that allows European companies to bypass US sanctions. So everything that the United States has done so far hasn't really worked.
Although, as you're saying, they're not the only superpower right now, but he told all nations to isolate Iran. They're already, though, putting up a plan to bypass the US sanctions.
Yes. So, these are the closest allies that the United States traditionally have had. But the European Union and the European states individually, Macron and Merkel in particular, they don't buy into the narrative of Iran being the evil empire. They see Iran as an opportunity. They are unhappy with how Iran is dealing, with foreign policy in Yemen and in Iraq and in Syria, because it has been a destabilizing factor. They don't like how Iran is dealing with its ballistic missile program. But they do realize that engagement through the JCPOA has actually caused the Iranians to come around. It opened a door for negotiation. It starts with nuclear non-proliferation and the stop of nuclear enrichment, and could potentially go to the next step, looking at the disarmament or somewhat containment of ballistic missiles. It could deal with giving Iran confidence, because Iran is a country that operates out of an insecurity complex or an inferiority complex. They're paranoid that, obviously, looking at its history, the past 40 years, the West and the Arab allies around it have somewhat tried to encroach on this country, and they're just trying to defend themselves with unconventional means. That's how the Iranians look at it. So what is needed here is confidence building. You need to engage the Iranians and the regime and the government of Iran and show them that we are actually a reliable partner. What Trump has done is showing the exact opposite. He just undermined all these narratives that the Iranians have propagated, that America is to blame for everything, America is basically not reliable. And the closest allies that they have, the Americans right now, the Europeans in particular, they've been telling them, actually, no, we do want to be reliable and we do believe in the JCPOA and we think engagement is the right way forward. And the same is true now for the Gulf as well. If you look at the GCC, the 6 Gulf countries, the Arab Gulf nations, were always standing somewhat against Iran. But with the Qatar crisis last year, we have now a situation where Qatar, Oman and Kuwait are not so much hawkish anymore, but seeing Iran potentially as a partner rather than an enemy, and in very pragmatic terms, because they share a common region and they understand that in a common region, in a globalized environment, you need to engage rather than confront. And I think this is something that Trump doesn't understand. So the only allies that push with Trump right now are Israel, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. For the rest, the international community is somewhat pro-engagement when it comes to Iran.
Well, let's wait and see what he will say next. Thank you very much for coming into the studio and for that insight there, Dr. Andreas Krieg.
Thank you.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has said radical groups have started withdrawing from a demilitarized zone in Syria's Idlib province. Russia and Turkey established the zone to stave off a major offensive by the Syrian regime as it tries to retake the last opposition stronghold. In his address to the United Nations General Assembly, Erdogan also touched on the plight of Syrian refugees and his country's efforts to improve their lives.
We can't accept Assad as Syria's leader. We can't hope for democracy from a person who is responsible for the murders of hundreds of thousands. And I have come to that stance after considering the situation of the Syrians. 3.5 million Syrians are our guests now. They have fled from the tyranny of Assad. He is still bombing the civilians. If we haven't come to an agreement with Russia and Iran on Idlib, the bombing would have continued.
TRT World's diplomatic correspondent Hassan Abdullah is in Ankara and says the Turkish president is calling for sustainable peace in Syria.
The president has said that Turkey's efforts are paying off and more than 50,000 people, civilians in Syria who had been displaced, have now returned, and he said more are going to be returning. He's also talked about the radical groups. He said that the radical groups have also started leaving the demilitarized zones in Idlib, and of course this had earlier been one of the challenges. And also he's talked about the future of Syria. He said that Bashar al-Assad has a lot of blood on his hands of his own people, and he's lost the legitimacy to rule, and that there can be no peace with